Brian, thanks very much. It's good to be with everyone today. Basically, the Department of Agriculture sees this as basically two functions, two responsibilities. Goal number one is to make sure that farmers get a fair return for their efforts and their capital investment. And the second goal is to make sure that when consumers go to the grocery store and at the checkout counter, they get fair prices. And the reality is today that farmers are losing money on cattle, on hogs, and poultry that they're selling at a time when consumers are seeing higher prices at the grocery store, and as Brian alluded to, the fact that there are now record profits or near record profits for those in the middle. So part of this is a function of consolidation and concentration, and we've learned during the pandemic that this is also a resiliency issue. When there was a major disruption in processing capacity because there are so few processors, we saw significant disruption at the marketplace as well. So this administration is focused on four major steps to try to take action in this area. First, strengthening the current regulatory system that we have, our Packers and Stockyards Act, to make sure that we are identifying and holding people accountable for unfair and discriminatory practices. And that regulatory changes are now being undertaken as we speak. Secondly is to make sure that there's adequate price discovery in the market. Because there is such consolidation, there is very little cash transaction that takes place in this market, and so it's very difficult to determine whether or not the prices that are being paid to farmers are fair. And so we are producing studies, recently a couple of studies to provide more price discovery. Certainly want to work with Congress in their efforts legislatively to pass legislation that will expand the capacity for us to have information. Third, we want to make sure that when people go into the grocery store and they see things that are labeled a product of the U.S., we want to make sure that consumers fully understand and appreciate precisely what that means or what it doesn't mean, and whether people are taking advantage of whatever value-added opportunity that might present to increase price. And finally, expanding processing capacity and maintaining the small and very small processing facilities that are dotting the landscape today. We provided additional resources to keep those small processing companies in business recently by announcing about $150 to $160 million of assistance and help. And we have put together a $500 million effort to work with states and local governments as well as nonprofit organizations and the livestock industry to look for ways in which we can finance expanded processing capacity. We're doing this at the same time that agriculture is confronted not just with the issue of concentration and consolidation, but also the impacts and effects of severe weather, which are linked in part to climate. Whether it's forest fires or drought or hurricanes, obviously that's also causing a disruption. And as we build this broader processing capacity, we also want to build a more resilient food system. And right now, we're deeply concerned about the impacts and effects of drought on these beef prices and pork prices and poultry prices, because it could lead potentially to people having to sell their herds because they can't simply afford the cost of maintaining them, particularly in the western part of the U.S. For that reason, we've looked at a number of different steps to try to provide help and assistance to deal with the drought. And today we identified yet another way in which we can provide help and assistance. Historically, we've always provided resources to farmers to be able to pay for the cost of hauling water to their facilities. If they had a situation with a drought and they needed to access additional water, there's a cost associated with that, and we helped to defer some of that expense. We're now changing that program, the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program called ELAP. We're now changing that to include also assistance and help for transportation expense for feed. We know that these farmers, particularly in the western U.S., are going to be confronted with having to truck or rail feed from far distances, and that's going to be an incredibly increased cost to them. So we're going to use this emergency program to provide up to 60% of the additional costs that they're incurring above and beyond what they would normally incur for transportation expense. And for limited resource farmers, it could be as high as much as 90% of assistance and help. And the goal here is to focus on those areas that have been designated serious drought areas, D2 for 8 consecutive weeks or D3 or greater. The hope is that by providing this resource, we'll be able to make it easier for farmers to stay in business and therefore not basically create more disruption in the market. So a combination of focusing on concentration and consolidation, as well as making sure that we continue to look for ways to make the system more resilient, are steps that we're taking pursuant to the President's directive.